Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for this webinar on census and redistricting. As you know, Asian Americans Advancing Justice is working to ensure a full and accurate count of our communities in the 2020 census. As a national hub, we're working to develop curriculum and materials to support your Get Out the Count work, including fact sheets, toolkits, webinars, social media graphics, translated materials, and more. Today, we're excited to take a deep dive into how the 2020 census will impact redistricting. We'll be highlighting the importance of redistricting to the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities, and how our communities can engage in redistricting at the local level. Our speakers will also cover the legal considerations for redistricting, how it has been used to create political clout in the Latino community, and how different communities of color are working together on redistricting efforts. Lastly, we will talk about how the potential delay of census statutory deadlines will impact redistricting in the states and federal legislative efforts to address these issues. As you may know, this webinar is the 20th installment of our monthly census webinar series, which we launched in August 2018. If you missed our previous webinars and want to tune in, you can access them with the links on this slide and the next slide. We have an incredible lineup of colleagues today from the Asian Americans Advancing Justice Affiliation and the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund. Karna Ramachandran is the Director of Statewide Partnerships at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta. Justin Ballas is the Policy Director at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago. Julia Marks is a staff attorney with the Voting Rights and Census Program at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus in San Francisco. And Stephen Ochoa is the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund's National Redistricting Coordinator. And lastly, Terry Alminis is the Senior Director of Census and Voting Programs for Asian Americans Advancing Justice AAJC in DC. We will have Q&A at the end, and you can use the chat box or questions box to send your questions, or raise your hand to have your line unmuted so you can ask the question yourself. If you have questions during the presentation, please also use the chat box or questions box to send us your questions. This webinar is recorded, and we will send out the recording and presentation after the webinar. Check out our census website at countusin2020.org for all of our webinars and accompanying summary blogs. The website also hosts our toolkit, fact sheets, partner resources, and more. And we have a COVID-19 page with the latest information on changing Census Bureau operations and updated field guidance. And you can find information on Census Bureau operations and the latest changes announced translated on the different language pages under our main resources. This week, we also uploaded our census messaging guidance on the July 21st presidential memorandum in English, along with the key takeaways translated into 15 Asian languages. So check them out on our resources page. If you have any questions, Advancing Justice AAJC and API Vote are ready to take your census questions. So call the hotline at 844-2020-API or 844-202-0274 for answers to your questions in English and multiple Asian languages. This hotline is strictly for answering questions regarding the census, such as how can I fill out the census online, or what languages is the paper form available in. This hotline is not meant for filling out the census. So if you wish to fill out the census on the phone, please call the Census Bureau's questionnaire assistance phone lines. And you can find sample posts and shareable graphics in the toolkit. And here's an example of some of the translated graphics in the toolkit. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our first speaker, Karna.
Thanks, Bessie. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Karna Ramachandran, Director of Statewide Partnerships with Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta and the Georgia Redistricting Alliance. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So we often talk about the connection between census and redistricting, right? But what does that really mean? Well, we see one real life example in Georgia after the 2010 census. Based on the population data from the 2010 census, Georgia gained a seat in the US House of Representatives. We went from 13 representatives to 14. So in 2011, the Georgia legislature used census data to redraw the district lines across the state to even out the population across 14 congressional districts, which you can see depicted here. And then everyone who lived in that northwest part of the state, in that purple district in the left corner, voted in 2012 to elect their new representative in Congress. So that's an example of redistricting, right? So census data is very critical because it directly impacts the representation we have at the federal level. That's one example of the importance of census. With regards to representation, AANHPIs are the fastest growing population in the US electorate, right? So meaning that more and more of our communities in the US are able to vote. So if we are able to vote, it follows that we want very much to elect someone who will stand up for us. In an ideal world, voting district lines are drawn so that all or most groups of citizens could have a fair shot to elect someone they would want to represent them. But being that we have folks in power who want to maintain the old guard of white supremacy, that's often not the case. Instead, what happens all too often is that those who draw the district lines do it so as to get the result that they want. So back to that example of Georgia in 2011, the Georgia legislature drew the congressional lines to heavily favor the Republican Party. And so it follows that the majority of our state's representatives currently are Republican, white, and men. And a lot of our elected leaders are in the news for being really terrible leaders. Their leadership is bad with regards to public health, protecting our communities from COVID, voting rights for Black and POC voters, criminal justice reform, reproductive rights, you name it, we've been in the news. Next slide, please. So this manipulation of district lines is called gerrymandering, and it can happen at any level of government. So let's look at an example of a local school board here in Georgia called Gwinnett County. You've probably heard of Gwinnett County as well because we've been on the news lately because of the COVID rates being just off the charts. So the population of Gwinnett County is majority Black, Latinx, and AANHPI, 12.5% AANHPI. So you would think, right, that a county whose schools are filled with children of color would have a good mix of at least racial diversity on the school board. However, it was only in 2018 that Gwinnett County voters were able to elect a person of color to the board of the school board. That was Everton Blair, a Black and gay man. And prior to 2018, the board was entirely white. And one current board member has been serving for nearly half a century, 45 years, okay? So by the way, Everton Blair led the charge to implement safety measures for students and teachers given COVID-19, and he faced racist verbal abuse from that same board member who has been serving since the 1970s. But because of his leadership, right, our children and teachers will be safer this fall. So when we are able to elect people who stand up for us, it has a real impact on our lives. And we're poised in Gwinnett County to elect more diverse members to the board just based on population changes and shifts alone. So you better believe that next year, our communities here in Georgia will have a very keen eye on how Gwinnett County redraws its school district voting boundaries. Because despite the population changes, if the districts are gerrymandered in 2021, that could affect the actual power our communities have to elect candidates of choice in 2022. Next slide, please. Thank you. So why should AANHPI communities get involved in redistricting? So if we want a say in how our communities are run, in how resources are allocated or how policing is funded, or in immigration enforcement or the presence of ICE in our communities, right? Like if we want to say in how polluted our environment is or how our children are treated in schools, then we have to be able to elect candidates who will stand up for us and stand with us in our values. In order for that to happen, we need to have a say in how the district lines are drawn. And I'm a firm believer that all of our communities should be able to determine ideal districts for themselves, with the help of amazing demographers that you'll meet one later, Stephen Ochoa. Also, by getting involved proactively, we can weaken attempts to gerrymander our communities. And this point is especially important. We have protections against voter suppression and terrible gerrymandering with the Voting Rights Act, which Julia will cover later. However, there is one important protection that we lost in 2013, and that is Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Section 5 was especially important in states like Georgia, where there's such a long history of voter suppression against Black voters and other people of color. And Section 5 required states like Georgia to submit any voting change to the federal government for review. And so in the past, people like you and me could also review the plan that was submitted. So now, without the benefit of Section 5, our communities need to be extra vigilant about gerrymandering and really question voting district plans that are proposed next year and the year after at any level. We also have power as a community, and we can flex that power for fair redistricting. Any one of you on this call can ask your elected official to tell you the process they are using at any level to redistrict, whether that be city council, school boards, state legislature, etc. But we have to speak up and be proactive, and ideally, we also get that on record. Finally, the maps that are redrawn will last the entire decade until the next census in 2030. So if we work collectively, AANHPI, Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities, we can set up all of our communities to continue to build power over the next 10 years. And we'll see some examples of that with Stephen later. And with that, I will turn it back to Bessie. Thank you.
Thank you. As you said, if we want a say in all these important issues that impact us every day, then we have to be able to elect candidates who will stand up for us and stand with us in our values. So for everyone on this webinar today, please get involved proactively because we have power and we have to speak up. And I will turn it over to our next speaker, Justin.
Awesome. Thank you, Bessie, and thank you for laying the groundwork, Karuna. My name is Justin Vallis. I'm the policy director at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago. I use he, him pronouns. And could we slide over to the next slide, please? For us, we like to think about redistricting as part of a continuum of power building for our communities and the issues that we work on. Building off of the important work that's still going on around the census to ensure a fair, complete, and accurate count of our communities. We use that data is used to build and shape how districts are designed, laying the groundwork for the political boundaries that impact our everyday lives. That also impacts who we're able to elect to represent us and how much weight those elected officials give to the voices of our communities, which then impacts all of the campaigns that we try and run, trying to make the changes with our communities that our communities need. Next slide, please. And I know that sometimes when folks talk about redistricting or are asked about redistricting, it could feel like something new or something potentially overwhelming or technical. But really, when we think about how AANHPI communities can get involved, there are 4 simple starter steps. Really talking to your communities, building new relationships, finding partners, and learning about your state-specific timelines and rules for redistricting. Next slide, please. So when we say talk to your communities, we really want to drive home what redistricting is and why it's important. What are those impacts that it makes on the conditions of your schools, on the conditions of your neighborhood, and what impact it has on legislation at the state and federal levels that impact our communities. One exercise that we're looking at and working with here in Chicago is talking to our community members about what would our community look like if we drew it on a map. And that's not to say that we're trying to create our own districts or engaging in like a super technical piece, but more having a conversation within our community about like, where are the boundaries that we know my neighborhood goes from this street to this street and over to this street, and making sure that we have a robust conversation with our community about what that looks like and who's in there, right? That also leads us to think about what other communities share space with us or share interests with us. Who are those neighbors that aren't Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians or Pacific Islanders, but are still a vital part of our neighborhood? We want to make sure that when we talk to our folks that we're able to use these opportunities, much like we've used the census around building those community connections, building that community power, and really starting to build up new relationships. And so that kind of segues into our next slide, which I forgot to change the order on those, but that's okay. When we think about building the relationships, this is a vital part of what redistricting looks like, knowing that while Asian Americans are the fastest growing community, we don't across the board have communities in such concentration where there are a lot of Asian American only districts, right? A big part of what these relationships look like are about our communities coming together with other communities nearby to talk about what our needs are and what some of our shared struggles are, and really starting to build and deepen those relationships and solidarity. One key component of that is also thinking through who else should be at the table, right? What are the barriers for folks to join in these conversations? One of the things that's particularly salient for us in Chicago is thinking through what are the linguistic needs for our communities to be able to participate in this? Are we getting the right interpreters? Are we translating materials? And are we inviting folks in ways that they feel like they can fully participate and share their voice and perspectives? So I think a key component in that relationship is making sure that we're not leaving folks behind. And then next slide. We would also like to talk about finding our partners, right? We in organizations and in community know the organizations that are already working in and with our communities. Those are folks that we should be talking to and sharing some of our analysis and thinking through what redistricting could mean for our community. A lot of those organizations are probably folks that y'all already partner with. I know that's a thing that's really true for a lot of our work here in Chicago, that a lot of our partners on various campaigns that we run are also folks that should be involved in this conversation around redistricting. And I think it's also important to point out that it's okay that not every organization is an expert at redistricting, and that there are important spaces for partnerships to benefit from each other. There are organizations that are really specific in the details around redistricting and how to draw lines and communities of interests and all of the technical things. And those organizations benefit from having our community voices at the table and being able to hear from our communities what we see our neighborhood looking like. And for us and for our community work, that also helps leverage the technical expertise that other partner organizations have. In Illinois, we work really closely with our partners at Change Illinois, and other folks across the state are looking at redistricting and have been for quite a while. And that is a huge help for us. So that way it doesn't all fall on a couple people in each organization to become redistricting experts. And then next slide, please. The last piece would just be taking some time to learn about your state-specific timelines and rules for redistricting. Not every state is going to follow the same guidelines and timelines. It's important to understand if the lines are being drawn and decided by an independent redistricting commission by an appointed commission or if they're done legislatively. What are those points for advocacy and where are those opportunities for folks to engage and really say, this is what my community looks like and this is what my community needs. Those are all important parts in building that campaign around involving AANHPI communities in the redistricting conversation. And with that, I will turn it back over to Bessie.
Justin, thank you. As you said, redistricting is a continuum of power building for our communities, and there are just 4 simple steps: talking to communities around you, building new relationships, and making sure folks are at the table and are able to fully participate, finding partners, and learning about timelines and roles in your state and the opportunities for advocacy. Thank you so much for going through those steps and your guidance, and I will turn it over to our next speaker, Julia.
Great, thank you, Bessie, and thank you, Karuna and Justin, for that great discussion of why redistricting is so important and such a great power building opportunity. So I'm a staff attorney at Asian Law Caucus, and I just am here to give a brief overview of those key legal concepts with redistricting. First slide, please. So as Justin helpfully mentioned, the specific rules are going to vary depending on what state you're in and what level of redistricting you're engaging in. So just to be clear, you can be looking at redistricting in terms of the congressional seats. How is the whole state map going to look? Or what are some ideal district maps for your specific region of the state? You can also be looking at state legislative districts, or you can be looking at the more local level. What are the city council boundaries district boundaries going to be? What are the county supervisors boundaries going to be? What's the school board going to look like? So I just included here maps of where I live in Oakland to give some context that the level you're looking at will just kind of shape how you're considering what your community is and what advocacy opportunities there are. So our top map here is obviously at a much higher level because it's a state map, state district, and then the bottom map is our city council. So there you can have more kind of granular community conversations and highlight those nuances of differences between neighborhoods. Next slide. So there will be differences between states and also within states between the different levels in some key components of the districting process that'll affect your advocacy. So first, the timeline differs. And as Terry will talk about later on, the timelines are very much in flux right now because of possible delays to the release of the census data that redistricting relies upon. There's also variation in who decides the maps. So, many states, the legislature decides the maps, but some states have an independent redistricting commission that's just made up of interested citizens. Some have a politically appointed redistricting commission. Some have an advisory commission, and others, there's a variety of formats. So figuring out who's the decision maker and when they're making their decisions and when they're collecting input is going to be very important. There are also different ways to provide testimony. Sometimes there are hearings or opportunities to go in person. Sometimes there are ways to, draw a map and email it in with a written description of what your community looks like. So research those opportunities, and then also figuring out who are the decision makers and if there are other, relationships you want to start building, like relationships with lawmakers so that you're in a good position to have influence when it's decision time on the map drawing. And then finally, there's significant differences in some of the substantive requirements between states. So there are a couple considerations when a map is drawn that are universal, which I will discuss. And then there are key themes that show up in very many states about what a map should look like, what factors need to be considered by the map drawers, But there is some variation between states in kind of the details of that and in which ones are the most important factors. So I'll go through that next. Next slide. Thank you. So no matter where you are, when the map drawers are putting together a map, they need to make sure that each district has the same total population. So that's true for your local city council, that's true for your state assembly maps, that's true for your congressional maps. I will note that what equal population means is a little bit different if you're at the congressional level. If you're looking at your statewide congressional maps, the standard's a bit higher. So those need to be as nearly equal as possible. Whereas if you're working at a smaller state level, there's a tiny bit more flexibility in how much variation you can have between district populations. But the primary goal is to get each district to be about the same size. And then it's also very important to note, as is on all of our minds last week and this week, that equal population means total population. So apportionment under the Constitution is based on the total population within each state. And despite the efforts by the Trump administration to change this, the Constitution is very clear that total population is what matters when we divide up congressional seats between the states. And so historically, redistricting has also been based on total population, just as the apportionment process has been based on total population. But one thing we want to keep watching is to continue to make sure and push for the redistricting process itself and the drawing of the lines to be based on total population. You know, children count when we're thinking about population, immigrants count, and despite efforts to reshape who counts, you know, we need to fight back so that we're not redistributing power in a way that's unfair and that benefits white communities and conservative communities. Next slide, please. Okay, so the other rules that apply no matter what state you're in or no matter whether you're working on a statewide map or a local map is the Voting Rights Act. So as Karuna mentioned, redistricting and map drawing has been used to prevent voters from communities of color from electing candidates of their choice in the past. Map drawing can be used for good to build power, but it can also be used to discriminate. So there are two main ways that discrimination has shown up in map drawing. So the first is to densely pack all the members of a minority community into one district so that they only have a majority in that district and then have very minimal influence in any other district. Another way that map drawing can be used to suppress the voice of minority communities is to divide a minority community into many different districts. So they're just a small percentage of each district. And then there's no district where they have enough of a presence to elect the candidate of their choice. Next slide, please. So the VRA is meant to prevent that from happening, prevent that type of manipulation. So what it does is it, you know, protects the minority community voice and protects against this type of vote dilution. What it'll do is require that district boundaries are drawn in a way that gives minority voters equal opportunity to elect the representatives of their choice. And so there's kind of a test laid out to determine if this kicks in. So first it asks, is the minority community large and somewhat geographically concentrated so that you'd be able to draw a district that would include a majority of that community or of a coalition of like-minded communities. And then it also asks if that group, that minority group that could be drawn into a majority for a district, if they are politically cohesive, are there, you know, shared political goals and interests there? So it's not necessarily a straight question like, oh, do these folks usually belong to one party or another, but like, are there shared political interests, or would a certain type of candidate be more appealing than another? And then the other question is, does the majority group vote in a way that defeats those preferred candidates and those preferred choices, right? So if you're not protecting the minority group, are they losing the opportunity to have a voice? And then finally, courts look at whether, and map drawers should think about whether there's a kind of totality of the circumstances in that area that show a history of vote dilution and ongoing vote dilution. So that can be looking at prior discriminatory voting laws and voting practices, a history of the elected officials that the minority community would choose not being viable candidates or not participating in the system, other types of discrimination against that minority group that are not necessarily directly in voting, but would have an impact on that group's political power, such as employment opportunities and education opportunities. So it's kind of a bigger picture question of what are the dynamics here that are excluding these communities from political opportunity. So if you go through that list and all of those things are true, then the map needs to consider that and draw a majority minority district that will stop that discrimination that is preventing that community from having a voice. I also want to note that in some cases, the VRA will require districts that are built around coalitions of minority voters. So you might have folks from different ethnic or racial groups who share very similar interests and have all been excluded from electoral influence in an area. So as Karuna and Justin noted, it's really important to think about, the community you work with directly, but then other communities in the area who have similar challenges and goals. I also want to refer back to something Karuna mentioned and just add a little more. So one thing that is different in this redistricting cycle compared to the one in 2010 is that the Voting Rights Act used to have this provision under Section 5 that required certain jurisdictions to affirmatively get approval of any maps to make sure that the map change did not discriminate against communities of color and did not violate the Voting Rights Act. So at the time, a wide variety of states had this section apply to them because of their history of discrimination. But in 2013, the Supreme Court found that it was unfair the way those specific states had to get their maps pre-cleared, whereas others did not. And so right now that section does not apply. It's possible Congress could come up in the future with a new formula to determine which jurisdictions need to get pre-clearance of their maps, because as we know, there are many jurisdictions that have a history of using voting processes and map drawing to exclude communities of color. But for now, there is no such requirement that there's a pre-clearance by the Department of Justice or a court signing off on a map. So what that means is that when we're looking at the map drawing process and doing advocacy to map drawers, it's important for us to try to identify places where the VRA does require a majority minority district and point that out to the map drawers. Say in your advocacy, our community is here, we are large, we can be a majority of this city council district if you draw it this way, or we and our coalition partners can be a majority, and you need to consider us. And then later on, after the maps are drawn, if needed, civil rights groups can bring lawsuits to enforce the Voting Rights Act and say, you didn't listen, you drew the map wrong, here we are asking you to change it, and a court can intervene to require that to happen. But we don't have this protection that we had before of Section 5 requiring that it be affirmatively approved before it goes forward. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so there are other common redistricting criteria. So the two that I already went through apply everywhere, no matter what. And then the ones, this and others, apply in most places, but the degree to which a map drawer thinks about each component can vary depending on your state and what the laws are in your state. But one of the key considerations in drawing a map is whether communities or groups of people who have common interests and concerns are kept together in a cohesive whole, right? Because folks are supposed to be electing someone who will stand up for what they need. And so to advocate for a certain map, it's really helpful if you can articulate, what makes your neighborhood and community unique? What are some of the shared goals that would, that you all would be looking for in your candidates? What are some of the things that might come up at a community forum that are important to you? You can think about cultural traits. You can think about socioeconomic traits. Maybe a lot of folks in a certain neighborhood are renters versus homeowners. So that might be one of the characteristics that defines a community or a neighborhood. And you can also think about, what are like public transit situations? Is there a regional component that's shared through highways or through here in the Bay Area, the BART train? Think about what connects different parts of your city and your community within the city. You can go to, one other point before the next slide is sometimes when we do this in workshops, people really get focused on the race and ethnic component. And while that can be an important part of a community of interest conversation, it shouldn't be like the only piece that people are thinking about. And so sometimes it's helpful to kind of step back and say, okay, we see that we share this, racial background, but are there other things? Or is there a small business district that we tend to spend time with, or is time in? Are there kind of school funding concerns that unite us? Are there cultural holidays and festivals that are meaningful to us? So take a broader lens in addition to just thinking about what racial and ethnic communities live where. Next, please. Okay. And then I'll quickly go through some other criteria and can follow up with more detail as needed. I'm just watching the time. So when folks are drawing maps, they also are thinking about keeping the district together, so you don't have like an island in a different part of the city that's part of your district and that isn't connected geographically. You might also think about political boundaries, like having your city kept together within a congressional district rather than broken into multiple districts. And you may also look at compactness, so something's not, stretched out long and skinny. And none of these things are treated as, a checklist. You can't just go through and say like, great, this is compact, done. You're trying to balance all of these at the same time. So just when you're doing your advocacy, it's helpful to know that whoever's drawing the maps will be thinking about, the VRA and complying with VRA, but they'll also have some other factors they're considering. So you can say you have to comply with the VRA, but if you're able to do it in a way that also fits with these factors, your map might be, more appealing to the map drawer. Next. Okay, a few more. Sometimes folks are looking at natural boundaries, like is there a river or a mountain range? And then also looking at the existing legislative boundaries or looking at, nesting districts within bigger districts. And then occasionally map drawers are trying to protect their own seat. And so they're thinking about the incumbency. Sometimes that type of thing is prohibited, so it's worth looking at your local laws. And then folks also think about political outcomes when they're drawing maps. And we know now that that's not prohibited through federal law, but there are some state laws and state constitutional bases for potentially pushing back against partisan gerrymandering and excessive consideration of political outcomes in map drawing. So I'll end there and pass it over to Stephen. Thank you.
Julia, thanks so much. Thanks for walking us through the key components that may vary state to state. Timeline, who decides the maps, how community members can provide testimony, and the many criteria for drawing districts. And understanding what this looks like in each state is absolutely essential to making sure our communities can engage. And you've made it so clear the significance of the Voting Rights Act for our communities. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our next speaker, Stephen.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Give me a minute while I show my screen. All right, just double checking people can see my screen.
Yes, we can see it.
Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Ochoa. I'm MALDEF's National Redistricting Coordinator. I am MALDEF's demographer. I do our election analysis, and this upcoming, we call them cycles. This upcoming cycle will be my third redistricting cycle. And I just wanted to share a little bit about MALDEF's work. For those of you, if you don't know who MALDEF is, we are the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. We call ourselves the Lawyers for the Latino Community. We are a civil rights nonprofit law firm and an advocacy firm, and we have been doing redistricting essentially since our founding over 50 years ago now. And we have, we have been involved in numerous redistricting cycles on basically the two ways that we can affect maps, in the advocacy space and in the litigation space. Thank you to my partners at Advancing Justice. That was an excellent summary of what the redistricting process is and the rules of redistricting. I also wanted to point out that I forwarded to our organizers a set of tools that some national groups, including MALDEF, put together on Redistricting 101. So I'm sure they will be forwarding them off to you, some additional tools that you guys can have on basic Redistricting 101 principles. Hopefully it'll be a helpful tool to get yourself orientated on the process. So I just wanted to say there's basically, I've been asked to give some examples of our redistricting successes and our examples of our coalition work, particularly our multi-ethnic coalition work. So I'm just going to go show a few slides with maps. I'm only going to have some maps. And then at the end, I will also show a little bit of the GIS software that redistrictors like myself use to zoom in and show details. And maybe during the Q&A, I can take some requests to zoom into certain areas. But basically, there are two ways to affect the redistricting process. There's what I call the advocacy process, and there's what I call the litigation process. And I've got some three examples of what I would call recent MALDEF redistricting successes. The first is, this is an example of advocacy and litigation. So this is Texas. So the blue lines you see on the map are were the past congressional boundaries before the census data came out. And then the common theme the shading you'll see is red areas are majority Latino citizen voting age population, or CVAP. The yellow areas are majority Anglo. Anything in green is majority African American. Anything in blue would be majority Asian. And if you see gray area, that means there's no majority. It could be a 40-40 split for one demographic group. But the point is, so this is the area between San Antonio and Austin. And before redistricting, the Latino population in Texas basically helped Texas gain 4 congressional seats. And so new seats were to be added. And through MALDEF advocacy, we submitted a plan where we actually put a district that stretched between San Antonio and Austin. It's Texas, so litigation happens. And after our litigation, we eventually had the creation of the 35th congressional district in Texas. And, it's this shape that kind of goes mostly in San Antonio, and it goes along the freeway, or the highway, I'm sorry, for the non-Californians, all the way into Austin. And this creates a Latino majority CVAP opportunity district. So Latinos can elect a candidate of choice in this district. So, and that's what MALDEF does. that's what we really look for the VRA standard that Julia had described. And we show that Latinos could be a majority, that they voted cohesively, and that the Anglos in the area around them did not vote for their candidates of choice. So that helped us prove that this district needed to be created, and it's been there since. And then this is just, and this is the CVAP of the time of redistricting, and this just is the CVAP of today, the most recent information to show the area is getting redder. So this district just got even more Latino. So it's just solidified into an opportunity for Latino select candidates of choice. The next area is an example of litigation. So this is Kern County in California, which is north of Los Angeles County. The main town is Bakersfield. And in 2011, the Kern County Board of Supervisors, a 5-district jurisdiction, they basically kept the status quo plan. But if you'll see, there was one Latino district here in the middle, which is Bakersfield based, but you'll see there's these farming towns right here, Delano, Wasco, Shafter, which the label didn't show up, that they were kind of spread out from each other. And so we actually advocated that, hey, you actually have the opportunity to draw 2 Latino districts in Kern. They didn't. Fast forward a few years, CVAP had increased, right? So this is now just the same plan. CVAP increased, Latino CVAP increased, and we actually sued under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and that there should be a 2nd district. And in December 2018, we won, and then in December of November of 2018, it had its first election under a new Latino district. Now, this district may look funny in shape, but it actually mirrors a long-held shape of our state assemblies and state senate districts. So these communities have been, they're both farming areas. There's a main highway that kind of unites them, and it's, there's a lot of interests and shared interests aside from just the demographics. And we proved, that there should be a 2nd district, you still see a Bakersfield based district in the middle. So this was an actual litigation gain. And then last, I would probably want to give you an example of an advocacy gain, although there's an litigation asterisk to this story. So this is the this is Los Angeles San Fernando Valley. If you ever heard the term valley person or valley girl, this is the valley that you're usually referring to, like totally. But you'll see that there were 2 congressional districts in the San Fernando Valley coming into the last cycle. And you see that this district here in the middle is kind of like the stake, and then there's this horseshoe shape. And this was drawn on purpose by the legislature in 2000 to basically shave Latinos around the edges, and shift some Latinos into this district and anchor these Latinos to this very affluent Anglo area, high voter turnout. So basically that Latinos, this is a cracking example as Julia described, where Latinos were not able to elect a candidate of choice, in the San Fernando Valley, and because they were split between 2 districts. And this is actually, and so we advocated to the State Redistricting Commission, like, no, these communities really need to be together. And voila, they ended up drawing a district, and this district now elects a Latino to Congress, and has since 2002. And the 2 previous incumbents actually ran against each other in this super white district. They actually moved to run against this district, and one had to beat the other. So this was an advocacy. We didn't have to litigate. The commission drew this, and I say there's an asterisk to this because in 2000. Maldiv sued the state legislature over what they did here, because the shape prior to this was actually closer to this compact shape, but it was a little less Latino 20 years ago, and the Anglo candidate in this district previously had a underfunded Latino primary challenger to the Democratic primary. And that person, underfunded, didn't try, got a respectable amount of Latino votes. And so he hired his brother to draw this shape because, in his brother's words, to my face, said, his brother had better things to do than district maintenance. So this is a prime example of an elected trying to choose their voters as opposed to the other way around. And then this is just the most recent CBAP, so you can see it's still a solidly Latino district. So these are examples of successes, both litigation and in advocacy. But that said, part of MALDI's philosophy is, when we draw, we try to draw for first, I like to say, we draw for the Constitution, then we draw for the compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act, and those are big rules 1 and 2 in redistricting. And then after that, we try to draw for as many communities of interest as possible. And we also have the philosophy of, there are, we are growing, and in many states, largest minority group, but there are other minority groups who share many of our same issues. And so if we can gain a large coalition, we can, of supporting a certain ideal, it limits the ability of people who don't have our interests of pitting us against each other. So I just wanted to give a few examples of areas where MALDIF frankly has to, we want to, but also have to work in coalition in a multi-ethnic coalition setting. So these are our California State Assembly districts. This is Los Angeles County / North Orange County. This Anaheim, here's where Disneyland is. And you can see again, this is what the commission drew. These are the current state assembly lines. So here we have, we had a 50% Asian CBAP district, so we believe was a Asian minority voting rights district. So we had to respect this. So we worked in concert with Advancing Justice Los Angeles, and we worked in concert with an African American collaborative, because you see these green areas down here are majority African American areas. And, we had to make sure we were trying to, Latinos had grown in Southern California, so we did earn more opportunities to elect candidates of choice, but we also didn't want to take away, at least not through redistricting, other groups' power, or prevent other groups from gaining power, gaining their communities of interest. So in 2011, MALDIF worked with a Black group and Advancing Justice Los Angeles, then APOLP, and we actually submitted a unity map to the state commission that we all endorsed to show as evidence that, hey, we aren't pitting ourselves against each other. We've worked with community partners all over the state, particularly in this Southern California region, where, as you can see, it's so multi-ethnic and so dense. There's large pockets of large groups of everyone that there's so many voting rights considerations as well as community of interest considerations that it's just, it's such a tough puzzle that if we are legal and strong community-based organizations can come together and kind of give the commission a heads up, that's what happened. And for the large, in many respects, they took these boundaries that we had submitted and roughly kept the rough shapes. So that, so this was probably our biggest unity map success of the last cycle. And it just also highlights, though, that especially in an area like Southern California, we really do need to work together so we aren't pitting ourselves against each other. Because usually when minorities are pitted against each other, it doesn't benefit the minority community as a whole. And this is just, our philosophy as well. As was said in previous presentations, you want to get as many partners as possible on the same page to support your areas. Even if you're just a community of interest and want to have a neighborhood kept whole, like here in this 53rd Assembly District, this area is called Koreatown. We wanted to make sure they were at least kept whole, even if they are within a Latino district, because if they're kept whole, they have the best chance of getting the attention of whoever is in this office. Because they deserve to have, their constituency services as well. So that's just our philosophy. Another example of coalition work that we worked on is in Chicago. So AAJ Chicago, who's on the line, we worked with their office about 10 years ago, and these are the boundaries that exist now. But this right here, this blue area is Chinatown in Chicago. and it was, I believe, split up at least twice in 2 ways. And but you can see that it is within a Latino region. So we submitted a partial state house assembly plan, a unity plan with AAJ Chicago to say, hey, this is one way to improve Latino representation. They didn't do as well as the state commission. The Illinois legislature didn't pay attention as well as the state commission, but they did at least properly maintain Chinatown whole. And we worked with our Latino community members in this area to say, hey, they should at least be kept whole. That's just like the minimum respect that's deserved, and that helped, and I believe this helped keep them whole. But you can see Chicago is just another area where multi-ethnic groups are just intermingled together. And I would be remiss to, if we're talking about Chicago, to not talk about what Maldev calls the earmuff district. Congressional District 4 in Chicago, which for the longest time elected Luis Gutierrez, now I believe elects Chuy Garcia. You see the shape, right? This is this Latino area in the south, and it kind of threads through these white, and it kind of goes it actually hugs the county line, and then goes around and unites this Latino neighborhood to the north. This was a district Maldev litigated in the 90s to get created, and it was the first time a Latino in the Chicago area was allowed to be elected to Congress. And many people in redistricting focus on shape, funny shape. Clearly, there's something wrong. Something's going wrong. And we also want to say that shape is not evidence of a gerrymander. This is not a gerrymander. This is compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act. There are gerrymandering does occur in redistricting. I'm not saying it doesn't, but don't ever just look at a shape and say this is an obvious gerrymander, because this basic shape has been in place now for about 30 years, and it has given Latinos a chance to elect candidates of choice, and it's also gone around an African American community voting rights district. So the reason this shape is like this is also to preserve African American representation, and it's just this is another long-held example of two groups needing to work in concert with each other to respect each other's ability to elect a candidate of choice. So it's not you don't have to pit groups against each other. There are ways to try to get both. And does it happen? Is it always kumbaya? Absolutely not. But that's just something we strive to work for. And why our coalition work is important on the ground. Our coalition work is important on our grass tops and our statewide orgs. If you can get all the minority groups together on board, it's a powerful tool. Does it always happen? No. But it's something we do try to strive for. And I have to imagine we're going to work a little bit with AAJ to try to get Chinatown back whole, at least in a congressional district. So it's just, that's something we would advocate for. Is it the Latino district per se? No, right now, but it's something we want because it's just the right thing to do. Cutting up a community like this is mean. At the basics. That said, I'm going to actually just switch my view. So these are the last of my examples that I have. But I also just wanted to show one potential example, and this is just to demonstrate a little bit also of our software. This is Maptitude, which is one of the redistricting software I use. This is Houston, another multi-ethnic area. I don't have any district lines on, but you can see, there's an emerging. I know there's a lot of talk of unity work in the Texas State legislative redistricting process. You can see the Sugar Land region. The Asian community has been steadily growing in southwest Texas, and this is something that we need to be respectful for. But this is a very complicated area to draw as well. But I also just wanted to show I can zoom in. I can go into detail. This is block group level. I could really go into to blocks if I want to, just to show you how powerful this software is. So I'll stop right there, and others, want me to zoom into different areas. I know we were talking about Atlanta earlier. Here's Gwinnett County right here by CVAP. So this is that multi-ethnic area that that was referenced earlier. You can see it's where the power of mapping software. So I'll stop it right there and turn it over to Terry or answer questions.
Thank you. Thanks for walking us through this multi-ethnic coalition work and the software. Like you said, advocacy and litigation are two really powerful and impactful ways to do our work, and there is so much at stake for our communities, and the collaboration, coordination, and unified efforts to fight back against any efforts to pit our communities against each other is so important. So thanks to MALDEF for their leadership on that. And everyone, we will be sharing the resources Stephen mentioned on Redistricting 101 principles with everyone in a follow-up email after this webinar. And so we are going to move to our final speaker, Carrie, and then we will move to Q&A. So if you have any questions right now, please feel free to drop those in the chat box or the questions box, and we will be able to get to those during Q&A. And again, the presentation and a recording of this webinar will be shared after the webinar. Thank you. Carrie.
Great, thanks, Bessie. And I'm going to try to roll through these slides pretty quickly. As I'm sure everyone well knows, census data and the impact on redistricting, of course, apportionment data is meant to be, is the reason, right, the constitutionally mandated reason why census is taken. And so both the apportionment data and the redistricting data are the tie-ins from census to the redistricting work. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we're all painfully aware of is that COVID-19 has had an immense impact on the taking of the census. Just to quickly go over what has happened in March 2020, right? The global COVID-19 pandemic really began to publicly intensify in the United States. We saw many states issuing stay-at-home orders, and the Census Bureau actually suspended its field activities and closed field offices. And then in April 2020, the Bureau adjusted its operational schedule and extended its census data collection into the fall with a 3-month extension with a new end date for field operations and self-response of no later than October 31st, 2020. Now, a reminder, had the operation shift not been, not been adjusted, or the operational schedule had not been adjusted, today actually would have been the last day of the census, and we would have been wrapping up otherwise. And so, the operational plan has this idea of ending by October 31st, the non-response follow-up activities and wrapping up the self-response phase, but the current operational plan is still fluid and ever-changing. Next slide, please. So, initially, when the Census Bureau announced its operational schedule shift, it also mentioned a request to Congress to shift its statutory deadlines by 4 months. So the apportionment data that I have referenced before would have, under current law, would be delivered by December 31st of this year. So the request to Congress was to move it from December 31st of this year to April 30th of 2021. And then similarly, with the redistricting data, the PL files, the statutory deadline as in current law is by April 1st, 2020, and the request was to shift that deadline to July 31st, 2021. Next slide, please. So this is just to give you a sense of where all the different states are, as I know it's been mentioned by my colleagues that there are different rules that are in place by states. And what's important to note is that a shift of 4 months in the delivery of redistricting data would have impacts for all these states with respect to when and how they can get their redistricting done. Right, some of these states have very tight deadlines that anticipate a delivery of date by, say, mid-February. For example, the 2 states that have legislative elections regularly scheduled for November of this year, New Jersey and Virginia, can only really accomplish that with data coming out in February, mid-February. And so this delay, of course, is making folks scramble and try to figure out what to do. For example, New Jersey, they're talking about rescheduling, for example, their election. Next slide, please. So really, again, for the states with legislative elections regularly scheduled. We know that even if census data were to be provided as early as the middle of June, it would preparing for a November election would be virtually impossible. For states with constitutional deadlines, right, they would need to amend the Constitution, one option, and that of course has its own deadlines and hurdles, or a state could file a lawsuit. For states with statutorily set deadlines, then they can always set a new deadline via statute. And then for states where the census data delays will make it difficult to complete redistricting before candidate filing deadlines for the state primaries, they could possibly move either the primary date or the filing date, again with each having their own hurdles and consequences. And where permitted, the state could hold a special session for redistricting. Next slide, please. So the legislative landscape, very important to note that while the Census Bureau had made this request back in April for the extension of the statutory deadlines, Congress has not yet granted the requested extensions. So there are currently some legislative vehicles that would grant the requested extensions. One is the HEROES Act that passed out of the House, right, the next COVID recovery package. And then there are two standalone bills with the same name, Fair and Accurate Census Act, one in the House, one in the Senate, that includes the extension of the deadline. Now, the original strategy was that because the deadline was a request from the administration, that it seemed to offer an opportunity to add some provisions that would be aimed at improving the count in the 2020 census. So in the HEROES Act and in the Fair and Accurate Census Act, we have language or provisions around additional funding, additional language around reporting requirements, and language that would actually stop the creation of the problematic citizen voting age population redistricting data set that'll provide the CVAP data at the block level. Do want to note, shout out to Stephen's boss, Thomas Sines, who came up with the brilliant idea of adding this in to stop the creation of the CVAP redistricting data set. And recently, in response to a question of what will happen if Congress doesn't delay the statutory reporting deadline, the Bureau publicly stated, and really for the first time publicly doing so, that they are quote unquote past the window of being able to produce the apportionment data by December 31st. Next slide. So one of the main concerns around a 4-month delay to the redistricting data set was that there would be resulting chaos. And that the concern would be that as part of the chaos in trying to meet deadlines on a very shortened and compressed time frame is that that the redistricting process would cut out the public engagement and input that many have talked about today, right? And so again, working with Stephen's boss, Thomas Sines, we had concocted this legislative solution to that problem, the Community Participation in Redistricting, the CPR Act, that would basically not allow a new congressional redistricting plan to be enacted for 90 days after they receive their redistricting data, their PL file, in order to allow for meaningful public input. And then there are also some other little nuances around that, but that is the general idea of this legislative solution. It is a bill that has not been introduced yet, but we are working to potentially get it sponsored and introduced. Next slide, please. But one of the issues, and I will point you to the third bullet, is that I think it remains to be seen whether or not this bill that I just talked about, the CPR Act, will actually be, relevant anymore, because we have seen the administration, unofficially or withdraw the request for delivery delay. We've all seen the presidential memo. It's clear that the current president wishes to be able to adjust the apportionment account to illegally and unconstitutionally adjust the apportionment account. But within that, we have seen both in the Senate COVID package, right? So remember, I mentioned the House had passed the HEROES Act, but the Senate had yet to pass its bill. Frankly, it had yet to introduce until earlier this week. And in the version that was introduced by Senate Republicans, there is no language that actually provides an extension to the statutory deadlines. And what is included is pushing significantly more money than even advocates were asking for the sole purpose of conducting a speedier non-response follow-up. So you may remember I said that the non-response follow-up was supposed to last until October 31st. There are thoughts from the administration that they would like to push more money to try to shorten that time frame in order to actually be able to produce data by the end of the year. Look, it's very clear. Any type of effort to try to speed up non-response follow-up will only lead to an even more disastrous census. I think at this point we are fighting tooth and nail every day, every dollar, trying to eke out as good a census as we can get. And non-response follow-up, which is critical to being able to count those in our community that are most vulnerable and least likely to participate, needs to be done in a fulsome and robust way. So throwing more money at it at this point will not create a better count. All we will have, even if you remove the issue of whether or not the administration illegally tries to remove undocumented persons from the apportionment count, the numbers by sheer virtue of overriding what career folks from the Census Bureau are saying and trying to speed and shortchange the non-response follow-up process, we will end up with poor data. And once you have poor data at the apportionment level, your redistricting data will also be poor. I think to borrow a phrase from others, garbage in is garbage out. And with that, I know we're running a little over, so I will end there and am happy to take any questions that folks may have.
Carrie, thanks. So I'm going to turn it over to our colleague, Rima Roy, who has been running GoToWebinar and working behind the scenes to run the technology today. And Rima is going to be going through the questions submitted in the questions box first, then the chat box, and then folks with their hand raised, so your line can be unmuted to ask your question. And I will turn it over to Rima.
Great. Thank you so much, Bessie, and thank you so much to our panelists for sharing your wealth of knowledge. I'll actually go to Dennis first because he's had his hand raised since the beginning. So Dennis, I'm going to unmute you. You can ask your question. Dennis, I think you might be muted on your end. So you might have to unmute yourself. All right, go ahead, Dennis. All right, Dennis, I don't think we can hear you, so we might have to come back to you. All right, so we're gonna go on to our next question. Okay, so this first question is from Fabian. What's the perfect district look like to elect a BIPOC Congress?
Thank you so much for your questions. And if I can take that question, I don't think there is such a thing as a perfect district anywhere. So from Malta's standpoint, we look at the legal requirements, because any map that we put our name on, be it a MALDEF map or a Unity Coalition map, we want to also be able to defend in court. So there are things that we need for court standards, and all the VRA considerations that Julia said earlier. We have to take into account. So for a Voting Rights Act district for Latinos, we are looking for a district depending on the region of the country. So in the Ninth Circuit, where I believe Oregon is, Latinos need to be 50% of the CVAP, citizen voting age population, to start, and then we have to show racially polarized voting. Now that said, for many of you who are on the organizers on the ground who work on campaigns, local and on up, campaign and election are different than voting rights standards. MALDEF is nonpartisan. We do not pay attention to the partisanship, unless we are looking at ability to elect candidates of choice. So if it's a traditional Democratic or a traditional primary and general contest system, then we might have to look at the primaries to see if the minority group in question can control that primary election as well. So it varies. I don't know. I'm sorry if this doesn't answer your question per se, but it varies, and it varies on the region. It varies on the minority group in question. Is there a coalition in question? Do African Americans and Latinos and/or Asians vote the same as well? They don't always do that. So it just varies, and this is why I think redistricting is part art, because I can give you, Julia and I can give you all the rules of redistricting, but even if everyone is playing by the same rules with the same goals, everyone's still going to have this slightly different map. So I'm sorry, it's my best explanation at this point. I don't know if Julia and Terry want to chime in.
Thank you, Stephen. Our next question is the mapping tool used by MALDEF publicly available at no cost?
Publicly available? Yes. No cost? No way. So the product I demonstrated is called Maptitude for Redistricting. And it is kind of like, it's been the standard software for redistricting since the 2000 cycle. The other most common GIS, Geographic Information System, which is a term for mapping software, is Esri's ArcView. Also is for purchase for high-end demographers, say like myself. That said, this cycle I have seen a lot of mapping tools being developed. Not all of them are publicly available yet, and most are still trying to beta and prepare for the redistricting cycle. Some of these tools only help you map your communities of interest, so they'll help you map your neighborhood boundary. And some are trying to allow you to draw statewide district plans. They all are in various stages of development. I know most are trying to be free tools, and I can't advocate for one or over the other just yet because I want to vet them a little more. But most of them seem to be well programmed and will at least let you create a boundary for communities of interest to help your advocacy.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, how can we pivot our census outreach efforts into making sure districts are drawn appropriately? How do we get access to district maps before they're finalized?
Hi, yeah, I can take that. And I just wanted to also say thank you, Stephen, for saying redistricting is art. I appreciated your answer to the last question. There's just so many factors and nuance. There won't be one right answer, though there might be wrong answers to how this gets done. So to this question, I just wanted to highlight a couple things in response. So hopefully, as you've been doing census outreach, you've been able to have some conversations about the way census connects to political power and can be a power building opportunity. So I'd say continuing those conversations after census, just making sure community members know that redistricting is on the horizon, and talking to the other organizations who've been doing census outreach about redistricting to see if you can collectively collaborate on impacting the redistricting process. And then from that, I see you've also asked about how to access the district maps before they're finalized so that you can engage in that advocacy. And I have to say that does vary significantly based on where you are and what types of maps you're looking at. So I'm out in California where we have a redistricting commission. And so here we have opportunities to provide testimony about communities of interest and to have community members propose draft maps. And then there are also requirements about the commission itself publicly posting whatever maps they come up with, and then giving folks a chance to weigh in on the maps and propose changes and explain what they'd like to see. So you'll just need to look into the procedure in your state, look at what the various, government transparency requirements are in place generally, maybe hearing notices are required, agenda items have to be posted somewhere. So try to figure out what transparency requirements generally and then specific to redistricting exist where you are, and those will be your chances to tap in. Or if you have contacts in legislative offices, you can talk to them about share your concerns and see where you can loop in to provide feedback.
If I may also just,
go ahead.
Sorry, if I also may just add to what Julia just said, rule of thumb, at least for a legislative process, redistricting is like passing a bill. So what are the rules your state or your city council or your school board follow to pass a bill? And sometimes they have public postings of notices and agendas, et cetera. And usually, often redistricting drafts are often buried there. So the rule of thumb.
Great. And I just want to thank you, both Julia and Stephen. I just wanted to add two thoughts. One, I think along the lines of what some of the messaging has been around census, it's in some ways also similar to how one can approach redistricting, right? And really talking about sort of helping people connect the dots as to how redistricting helps lead to needs being addressed from the community. I think, as everyone has talked about on the call today, is one piece of it. And the other piece I would ask, that I would say in response, is that many organizations will be engaging in redistricting. So it may seem a little daunting to try to figure out all the rules and whatnot, but I'm pretty confident that for many of you, if not all of you, there will be other groups working on this. And so you don't have to go it alone. So whether it's an Advancing Justice affiliate, whether it's MALDEF or other of our civil rights, partners and allies, there are people that you can connect with. And, if you need any help trying to connect with folks, you can always contact us at Advancing Justice AJC or the other Advancing Justice affiliates, if that is where you're located, to help find folks. And I know Stephen is always fantastic and accessible. Sorry, Stephen, to throw you under the bus there, but we're all happy to help try to connect folks. And then I did want to address quickly, there was a question in the Q&A around the CPR Act. To be clear, we don't have a bill to share yet. We are looking to potentially, we're working with Senator Murray's office to potentially sponsor the bill. Again, I think we do need to see that there is a path forward or an actual passage of an extension of the statutory deadlines, because if we don't have that, I think the bill becomes, irrelevant, for lack of a better word.
Thank you. The next question is it very likely that Illinois will lose a district after the cycle? What's going to happen if this becomes a reality? Who loses their district, and how will this affect other congressional and local districts and communities of color?
I can tell you Illinois lost a congressional district last cycle. And who usually, that's a legislative process, and usually whoever is in power will probably eliminate one of the other districts.
Yeah, and this is Justin. I think that's a really important question, and is something that we're taking very seriously, looking at what these changing populations are going to mean for our districts and for our campaigns and for our communities. I think one of the key things that I would touch back to is that not necessarily framing in a who wins, who loses, but like how are we better able to mobilize and organize our communities and build those relationships across our communities, so that way we can still make sure that the voices of our communities are heard. I think this is one of those powerful things, particularly when we think about what are communities of interests, how do we build some of these solidarity spaces for us to hold on to the representation that our communities need, even as things start to shift and change.
Thank you, Justin. I think that's all we have for our questions today.
Great. Everyone, thank you so much for being on this webinar today and sharing your knowledge and all of the different resources that you mentioned. I'm sorry that we ran a little bit over. On this slide, you'll see contact information for our speakers in case you would like to get in touch. We'll also share this in an email. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and you will get a copy of the presentation and the webinar recording in the next few days.